Rain hammered the windshield of the snowplow truck idling outside the pharmacy on Spadina, and Nathaniel Voss sat behind the wheel of his own car across the street, watching a young woman lock up a shop that should have closed an hour ago. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned much of anything for the last 6 months, not since the verdict, not since his name had stopped meaning the thing it used to mean. The pharmacy light flickered behind frosted glass, a single bulb fighting the dark. He'd come in because his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he needed something, anything, to make the noise in his head quiet down. The girl behind the counter wasn't the regular pharmacist. She was younger, maybe mid-20s, her name tag crooked on a blue cardigan that didn't fit the cold outside. Briar Calloway Finch, it read, though he wouldn't learn the name properly until later. "We're actually closed," she said, not unkindly. "But you look like you need something more than I can sell you behind a counter." He almost laughed. It came out more like a breath. "Just a headache," he said. "That's all." She studied him a beat too long, the way people do when they've sensed something underneath the words. Then she rang him up for aspirin he didn't need and slid a paper cup of water across the counter without being asked. "On the house," she said. "Drink it before you drive." He drank it standing there in the fluorescent hush of an empty pharmacy in February, snow ticking against the windows, and something about her patience, not pity, just patience, cracked something loose in his chest that he'd kept welded shut since Calgary, since the hearing, since the boy's mother had stood up in that courtroom and said his company's name like a curse. He didn't tell her any of that. He thanked her and left. He sat in his car for 40 minutes after, engine off, watching the pharmacy go dark window by window as she closed up alone. When she stepped out into the storm, scarf wound twice around her throat. Head down against the wind, he watched her walk 3 blocks to a bus stop that had no shelter, no bench under cover, just a pole and a sign half buried in snow. She waited there for 22 minutes by his watch. He counted because counting was the only thing keeping his mind from going back to the courtroom, to the boy's mother, to the silence after she'd finished speaking. He didn't follow her. He didn't introduce himself again. He drove to the hotel he'd been living out of, since he'd left the house in Rosedale to his ex-wife, and never moved back. And he sat on the end of the bed with his coat still on, and for the first time in a long while he thought about something other than the thing he'd built and broken. The next morning there was a note under his door. It wasn't from Briar. It was from the hotel, a printed notice about checkout times, and the ordinary banality of it almost undid him, because some small foolish part of him had hoped walking back to the hotel the night before that there might be something else waiting. That was the moment he understood how far gone he was, hoping for a stranger's handwriting on a piece of paper because she'd given him a cup of water and called it patience instead of charity. He went back to the pharmacy 3 days later, not for aspirin. Briar was behind the counter again, hair pulled back this time, sleeves pushed up over forearms dusted with old burn scars she'd later tell him. Came from a summer working a diner grill in Sudbury before pharmacy school. She recognized him before he said anything. "Headache guy," she said, and there was the smallest smile in it. "Nathaniel," he said. "Voss, I know who you are," she said, and his stomach dropped. Because he assumed the worst, that she'd seen the headlines, the photographs of him leaving the courthouse with his collar undone and his lawyer's hand on his shoulder, but she just shrugged. "You're the guy who paid for aspirin he clearly didn't need and then sat in his car for 40 minutes in a blizzard like a sad movie character." He felt his face heat. "You saw that. Spadina's not that big a street." He almost left then. Instead he asked her, voice rougher than he meant it to be, if she'd ever consider letting someone buy her a coffee that wasn't an apology disguised as a transaction. She studied him again, that same unhurried red, and said she got off at 9, and there was a diner 2 blocks east that made a passable grilled cheese, and he could try not to be mysterious about whatever was clearly eating him alive. He told her almost everything that night. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. That he'd run a biotech company called Callaway Renix that had built a glucose monitor implant meant to save lives, that a manufacturing flaw in a sealant supplied by a subcontractor in Ohio had caused a battery casing to corrode inside a 14-year-old boy named Caleb Drummond, and that the corrosion had gone undetected for 9 months because the internal audit team had flagged the issue and been told, by someone above them, that the fix could wait until the next product cycle, that someone had been him. Not directly, not with malice, but the email chain had his name on the final sign-off, and a courtroom doesn't care about nuance, and a grieving mother doesn't care about nuance. And frankly, he told Breyer, staring at his coffee going cold, he didn't think he deserved nuance either. Breyer didn't flinch. She didn't reach across the table and grab his hand and tell him it wasn't his fault, the way his lawyer had, the way the board's PR consultant had, the way everyone whose paycheck depended on his redemption arc had. She just said, "What did you do after you found out?" "I shut the product line down. I funded the family's legal fees, even though my lawyers told me not to. I resigned. I gave every cent of my severance to a pediatric cardiac monitoring fund in Caleb's name." He looked up at her. "None of it brought him back." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't. But you're the only person I've ever heard talk about it without trying to make themselves the victim of their own story." That sentence stayed with him longer than anything his therapist had said in 8 months of court-mandated sessions. They started meeting on Thursdays, then Thursdays and Sundays, then most days that ended in a Y. Breyer Calloway Finch was nothing like the women he'd dated before the verdict. The gallery curators, the hedge fund analysts, the women who knew exactly which fork to use and exactly how to angle a smile for a photographer. She worked 60-hour weeks at a community pharmacy that served half of Toronto's West End, half of whom couldn't pay full price, and she covered the difference out of her own tips jar more often than she'd admit. She had a younger brother she was putting through college on a pharmacy tech's salary. She drove a Civic with one door that didn't open from the outside, and she'd never once asked Nathaniel what his net worth was, even after she must have looked him up, because everyone eventually looked him up. It was March before she asked him to stop hiding it. "I know who Calloway Renix is," she said one night, sitting on the radiator in her tiny apartment above a dry cleaner's, knees pulled to her chest. "I knew the second week. I just didn't see the point in making you perform an apology you'd already spent 8 months giving to everyone else." He didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent so long being either villain or cautionary tale that he'd forgotten what it felt like to just be looked at, plainly, by someone who wasn't deciding which version of him she needed for her own narrative. He kissed her for the first time on a night in April, on the Spadina streetcar platform, snow finally giving way to a cold rain, and she kissed him back like it was the easiest decision she'd made in months. And for the first time since the hearing, Nathaniel Voss felt something in his chest unclench that he hadn't realized was still clenched. The company called him back in May. Calloway Renix had spent 8 months in freefall under interim leadership, stock down 61%, 2 major hospital contracts pulled, a class action settlement that had nearly bankrupted the firm. The board, desperate and humbled, wanted him back, not as a redemption story for headlines, they were careful to say, but because the company needed someone who understood both the technology and the weight of what had gone wrong with it. He told them he'd only come back if he could rebuild the safety auditing structure from scratch, with full authority, no quarterly targets overriding flag defects ever again. He didn't tell Breyer before he said yes. He told her after, sitting across from her at the diner with the passable grilled cheese, and watched her face do something complicated, pride and worry both folding into each other. "You're going back into the fire," she said. "I'm going back to make sure the fire doesn't happen to someone else's kid," he said. She reached for his hand then, the first time she'd done that in any conversation about Caleb Drummond, and said, "Then I'm with you. But Nathaniel, I'm not coming as your assistant. I'm not coming as your charity case. I'm Breyer. I have my own work. We figure out how this fits, or it doesn't fit at all." He loved her more in that sentence than in every grand gesture he'd ever made for anyone. The trouble started, as it usually does, with people who had never once stood in a courtroom or a pharmacy at midnight, but who had opinions about who belonged where. The first shareholder dinner Breyer attended with him in September, a board member's wife leaned toward another woman at the dessert table and said, just loud enough, "I suppose if you save a man's life, that buys you a seat at the table now." The other woman laughed, low, cruel in that polished Rosedale way. Or maybe she's simply very convenient. Breyer didn't make a scene. She set down her wine glass, walked to the coat check, and left without telling Nathaniel why. He found out 2 hours later, when a junior associate who'd overheard the whole thing finally worked up the nerve to tell him, white-faced, certain he'd be fired for repeating it. He found Breyer at her apartment, sitting on the radiator again, arms wrapped around her knees the way she did when she was holding herself together by main force. "I don't belong in that world," she said quietly. "I sell aspirin and antibiotics to people who can't always pay for them. I don't know which wine goes with which course. I don't know how to be the kind of woman those rooms expect." He sat down across from her, not touching her yet, and said the only true thing he had. "Those rooms don't deserve to expect anything of you. I built half my fortune in those rooms, and I can tell you, with complete certainty, that I learned more about what matters from one Thursday night with over a grilled cheese than I learned in 20 years of dinners like that one." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. "I need to know I can stand on my own before I stand next to you in a room like that again. Not because I doubt you, because I need to not doubt myself." She took a posting at a community health clinic in Thunder Bay that winter. Full-time, salaried, running medication access for a region that desperately needed someone who understood both pharmacology and poverty. It meant 14 hours apart by car, longer by the kind of weather northern Ontario produced in January. Nathaniel didn't argue her out of it, though every instinct in him wanted to. He drove her to the airport instead, and on the tarmac, in a wind that cut through wool coats like they were paper, she pressed something into his hand. A folded prescription pad page, the kind she used for handwritten notes to patients who couldn't read complicated dosing instructions. On it, in her blunt pharmacist handwriting, it said, "Take this as needed, once daily, indefinitely. You are allowed to be more than the worst thing that ever happened on your watch." He read it on the drive back into the city, pulled over on the Gardiner with hazards flashing, and for the second time in a year, cried in a vehicle alone. They didn't talk every day that winter. They talked enough. A line here, a photo of a particularly absurd patient interaction there. A voice memo at midnight when one of them couldn't sleep. He sent her files of the new safety protocol he'd built, not because she understood biomedical engineering, but because she was the only person whose opinion on whether it was good enough actually mattered to him. She sent him grainy photos of the aurora over Lake Superior with captions like "Still alive, still braver than I think," apparently. In April, the FDA equivalent board in Canada approved Callaway Renix's new implant line under the rebuilt safety framework, the first major product cycle since the recall. Nathaniel stood at the podium during the announcement, and against every instinct of his PR team, said Caleb Drummond's name out loud in public for the first time since the trial. He said the company didn't deserve forgiveness for what had happened to him. He said the only thing they could do was make sure no other family ever stood where the Drummonds had stood. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with shareholder math. 2 days later, he flew to Thunder Bay. He found Breyer at the clinic at the end of a Tuesday shift, counting pills behind a counter that smelled like rubbing alcohol and burnt coffee, hair escaping its clip, exhaustion etched into the soft lines around her eyes. She looked up and went very still when she saw him standing in the doorway in a parka that clearly belonged to someone who didn't own outerwear built for actual winter. "You flew 4 hours to stand in a pharmacy," she said. "I flew 4 hours because I'm done waiting for permission to show up," he said. "You don't need to finish proving anything to me, Breyer. You never did. But if you need more time to prove it to yourself, I'll wait in whatever pharmacy, whatever city, however long it takes." She came around the counter slowly, the way she had that first night, unhurried, reading him the way she always did, and this time what she found must have satisfied whatever she'd been guarding. Because she crossed the last few feet and put her arms around his neck right there under the fluorescent lights, in front of a waiting room of patients who would later swear the pharmacist Evan's stoic boyfriend had cried like a teenager. She moved back to Toronto in June, not because he asked her to, but because the position she'd built, both the clinical protocol reforms she'd pioneered in Thunder Bay and a parallel role consulting on patient safety communication for Callaway Renix, had outgrown a single northern outpost. She took the consulting work on her own terms, her own contract, her own seat at the table that nobody in that boardroom would ever again dare question out loud. 3 years after a snowstorm and a cup of water nobody had asked for, Nathaniel Voss stood at the back of a community health conference in Ottawa, watching Breyer Callaway Finch accept a national award for rural pharmacy access reform, her voice steady at the podium, her eyes finding his across the hall the way they always did, like the room narrowed down to exactly the two of them and nothing else mattered, and he thought, not for the first time, that the worst year of his life had somehow delivered him to the only person who'd ever made him believe the rest of it might still be worth living. That night, walking along the canal with the city lights smeared gold on the water, he didn't propose. He didn't need to. He just took her hand the way he had that first April on the streetcar platform, And she let him, and somewhere in his coat pocket, worn soft from 3 years of folding and unfolding, was a prescription pad note that still read, in blunt handwriting that had since become as familiar to him as his own, "You are allowed to be more than the worst thing that ever happened on your watch." He still took it daily, indefinitely.